Hey, so this is week 2, part 1 of our slideshows. So this is week 2, part 1, assignment 1. Let's get at it. So the first thing we really want to know is just a refresher really of what setting is. So we know the when, the where, but what else? Whoa! Let's get going. So setting is going to change from story to story. That's always going to happen. So some stories could take place at any time or any place, and the plot will not be affected because the events and characters remain the same in any time or place. However, some stories have settings that deeply affect the plot. So, for example, in a story set in a Native American culture, maybe something like we're going to read eventually, characters might make decisions based on their culture that would be different from another setting. So, when we're talking about this, the big misconception is that Western civilization is the only, prominent culture to think of. That's not the case. There are billions of other people, and that's what we want to represent, hopefully. First people are also known as Native Americans, and the second story that we're going to look at is based in India. So, just some ideas to think about how these settings impact or change characters in the story. So one example, how is the setting going to change the ideas and mentalities and characters if you're looking at the Deep South during the Civil War? And if you're looking at time even, how does that change the character of the Deep South now? What's different, what's similar? Clearly, Montana during the winter is going to be a little bit different than Florida. So how does that change and build a person and character? New York City during an election year, like this year, if you don't recall, a former mayor of New York City ran, and he eventually dropped out. A desert island after a storm, possibly flooding, you don't know. An airplane trip, that's a red-eye flight to Tokyo, which means that it's at night and it's nonstop. Ancient Egypt during a flooding season, so that's always interesting that we often also think of like the 4 seasons, but in some climates you don't have 4, you have 2, a wet season and a dry season, and the list can go on. So the big thing that I want you to think of are the 3 types of setting: temporal, spatial, and cultural. So those things help develop literary characters, possibly. Again, it also depends on the story. But let's look at temporal, or time. Historical period, year, season, time of day, etc., etc., etc. So temporal, time. Spatial is geographical or physical location. So also it brings up social implications, economic elements, that kind of idea. So the Great Depression is going to be different than the Roaring '20s. Just like the internet boom is different than the 2008 housing crisis, where there was a recession. And also cultural aspects, which will be different depending on the culture. So values and beliefs of the characters, what does the daily life look like, language and the way people talk. It goes on. Very, very quick overview. If you want to look at a better example, watch the video. It's way more exciting than me. Go ahead and look at it. Something even more exciting, a rap video. You'll never hear me rap. I appreciate it, but they're way better than me. And then let's go ahead and get on to the 2 stories that we're going to read that will tie into both assignments this week. So the first story is The Man Descend Rain Clouds by Leslie Marmon Silko. Who is she? So she was raised in the Laguna Pueblo Reservation in New Mexico. And she finds storytelling to be important. So storytelling help brings up issues and cultural aspects that people don't really get off of facts and data. And she grew up on tribal stories passed down, which would be called oral history. And our oldest types of history are actually oral history. And a lot of her writings explore what life is like for Native Americans today. And she contrasts traditional values with beliefs in modern life now. And you can see that with 2 different types of characters in the story. We'll get on that a little bit later. So, cultural setting of the Mantis and Rain Clouds. You're looking at a place in New Mexico. I think the image below does a great example, or above me, actually, not below. I'm looking down. If you haven't noticed that, I've been looking down. So it's looking at Native American reservation land, and it's looking at characters that are Native American as well as a Catholic priest. And the question to start thinking of is, how do these characters differ, and also what are their commonalities with that? If you look at the image below, I think that's a great representation of the setting that we're going to look at in that story. And let's go ahead and look at Laguna, Native American beliefs about death. So I don't want to generalize about all Native American tribes had the same identity. That's not the case. We're just looking at this aspect now of Laguna or Navajo beliefs on death. So bodies are prepared ceremoniously after death and quickly buried, with the head facing east and supplied with food, water, and other items for the afterlife. So I think we've heard other cultures in society, or other cultures that have similar practices in this way. And death isn't an endpoint, it's just the continuation or the next step of life. And instead of me trying to describe it, I am not teaching history right now. Look at this video that's linked below. That will give you a much better idea of what's going on. Our next story. Short story is going to be Old Man of the Temple by R.K. Narayan. And he was born in southern India. He was a teacher and writer. He wrote over a dozen books and short stories, or over a dozen books plus a lot of short stories. And the interesting thing about him is that he combines Western plots with Indian subjects and locations. So the cultural setting of the Mantis and Rain Clouds, it's a fictional city in India, and it's involving characters that are practicing Hinduism. So really quick, Hindu beliefs about death. They believe in reincarnation, which means that people are reborn right after death. And that's not always the case. It doesn't have to be immediately. It can also take a period of time before and after as well. And your rebirth and your next stage of life is determined by karma, which is good or bad things that you do in life. And it will lead to a good or negative rebirth. And if you continue, I would look at the video as well. That is above to the left of me as well. It will give you a better, more in-depth idea. I don't want to pretend that I am the all-knowing person of Hinduism. Look at the video instead. It will help out a lot. And that's about it for the video. Please, if you are having trouble reading the story, we also have attached audio recordings of both stories. I do one of them. Have fun.